All right. Episode 2 of The Stroke of Midnight coming at you. Greg Ellis here, Dorian Weinzimmer.
Howdy.
Dorian, how'd you feel about our debut episode last week?
I felt great about it. I right afterwards, basically anytime, and this happens with, I think, everyone who does any kind of podcast or interview or anything like that, speaking, recorded speaking for the first time in a while. It's like immediately afterwards, you're like, blew that. It was horrible.
You did a great job, my friend.
But thank you. No, I listened back to it and I was like, no, you know what? I'm really happy with this. It's just such an expansive subject. Speaking about one's heroes, and especially in the light of their passing and everything, it was kind of like hard to pick just a direction to go and actually say something instead of just saying a little bit of a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm happy that I kind of was like, no, let me just go from like my entry point.
Yeah. I think you did a great job of like making it more about you almost than about David, because that was really the idea, was to get everyone to, know who you are a little bit more. So, totally. Just let this be known. There will be a David Lynch part 2 sometime down the road where we can go deep down the rabbit hole. But today is Greg's day. The Holy Trinity of live performance by yours truly, Greg Ellis. Now, before I reveal who the Holy Trinity is, I would like to preface this episode by saying some of you are going to be angry. Some of you are going to think I've lost my goddamn mind. And some of you may turn this off before I get through 5 minutes of my spiel. That's okay. But for those of you who stick with it, there's gold at the end of this rainbow. So
I've had the slightest glimpse of it, and I can tell you, and you'll probably have all of those emotions and reactions. Actually, everything you just described, I think, will occur.
Yeah, I mean, here's the deal. I mean, I pride myself on not being inside of any bubble. I like to be wide open, whatever that means, whether it's my tastes, whether it's my abilities, whether it's what is asked of me, anything. Like, no is usually not an option, but also I like to be exploratory in all of the things. And that's kind of the whole premise of this podcast. And so the idea to kind of weave a line between these three entities is probably completely ridiculous, but if you hear me out, it probably also makes a lot of sense. So, with all of that preamble out of the way, the Holy Trinity of live performance. Phish, Howard Stern, and we're going to do this one specifically, even though we could do the whole genre, but I'm going to say WWE pro wrestling. All right. So I'm just listening for all the phones turning off right now.
Yep. Give everyone a second to kind of soak that in.
Soak that in, baby.
I also just want to throw in right now that when Greg pitched to me doing a podcast with him, he told me this, and the start of the pitch was I want to talk about this Holy Trinity of live performance, and it's Phish, Howard Stern, and WWE. And I was like, okay, where do I fit into this? And
you're gonna save me from myself. That's where you fit into this.
It was an interesting way to start the pitch. I was like, I mean, obviously I'm here and I'm super excited to do this, and I love the concept that we have at play here. But at first I was like, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah, of course.
But if you hear Greg out like I did, I think you'll come around and be very convinced that this is actually quite a discovery he's made.
So I'm not going to get too, bogged down in each institution's details and nerddom per se. This is more about how they approach live performance, not the things that they do specifically. Maybe there'll be some specifics, obviously, but I'm not going to sit here and recite, I had a bunch of people. So here's a great example. The other day, I posted. Dorian, I need to get you on Instagram so you can know these references. The other day, I posted a story. I found a VHS tape in my collection. Excuse me. That was a Dr. Seuss Day marathon from Cartoon Network, 12/7/1997. Now, for all of the people out there listening who do love Phish, that date is a very important date. It is the Dayton, Ohio Fall 97 show, and it's the probably what is considered the best tube and a number of other things. That whole Fall 97 run was widely regarded as Phish's like greatest singular tour. Yeah. So 12/7/97 is a very special show in Fishdom. And so to find this Dr. Seuss like tape that was also from 12/7, I was like, well, what if I sync the two together? Who would be into that? And I had more people ask me like, what the fuck are you talking about? Than being like, oh yes or no, that's a stupid idea. Why would you do that? You know, so my attempt or my goal here is to not do that to people. I don't want to get too lost in the minutia of each thing.
Sure.
Rather kind of, use these three, I call them institutions. They've both been around for nearly half a century now, in their own rights. Howard Stern started radio in the late 70s, came to prominence in the early 80s. If we look at WWE just in like the WrestleMania era, we're going into WrestleMania 41. So that would have started in 1985. Phish started in 1983. So everyone's kind of like on the precipice of that half century mark. I think when you have that kind of longevity, you become an American institution in one form or another, whether people like that or not. So what does every live performance need? Just start there.
What does every live performance need?
Yeah, simple question.
Spectacle?
An audience.
Yes, indeed. Indeed they do.
Yeah, man. So this was the seed of this entire kind of, nut house idea that I came up with, was like, these three things work with their audience in such unique ways, but also in such similar ways. But there's ultimately what's the most important aspect of what makes them them. Phish notoriously engages with the audience, whether it's behind the scenes, whether it's during the show, whether it's, in the ways that they build up to special events. I have this really fond memory of a Halloween show. It might have been 2003. So this was like right after they came back from their first hiatus. They had just started really embracing the internet, which this is also kind of like part of what makes all three of these entities very special. Their openness and willingness to utilize technology. So that we'll kind of get into that. But
sure,
Phish did a thing where they were letting fans vote on what the Halloween album was, if memory serves correct. And it was like every week it would whittle down. I can't remember exactly what the premise was, but there was this whole just build up to what the Halloween album was going to be that year. And they've always been very in tune with what the audience wants. Now, whether or not they gave it to them is a completely different story. And that's ultimately as important as listening, is knowing when to give the audience what they want and when not to give the audience what they want. And there is nobody better at doing that than the WWE. For as long as I can remember, the obvious thing isn't always the right thing, and the right thing isn't always the obvious thing. And, this past Royal Rumble was a great example of that. Myself and many others thought that my man CM Punk was going to finally get his WrestleMania main event via the Royal Rumble.
Hmm.
That did not happen. The next obvious choice was John Cena. He did not get it either. Instead, a little Samoan lunatic. He's not even a lunatic. His cousin's a lunatic. But Jey Uso, who was, they do betting now. He was a plus 2,000 betting odds. So if you bet on Jey Uso to win the Royal Rumble,
holy shit,
would have made a lot of money. And,
wow. I watched the Royal Rumble with some friends the past weekend, and one of my friends is like a fan, and he really knew who's hosting the event. And to watch his reaction during the Royal Rumble, like as it got down to the end, he was like hands on his head, like, no way, no, there's no way.
So I think a really important thing to like think about, because wrestling's the most interesting of the three in the sense that it blurs the lines between like scripted, on the fly, we have a plan that's, they'll have a plan 12 months out. That plan might shift and evolve over the course of those 12 months. And then at 11 months, they might throw that plan right out the window. And like, they do a masterful job of making it seem like everything was planned, even though maybe sometimes it wasn't. And I think this is a good example of them pivoting because maybe something else became more important or less important. And so like, you can't always judge certain situations on face value. Sometimes that thing serves another thing's purpose. And so like, it's this really interesting sort of dynamic of like, are we doing this for this story, or are we doing this to help this other story? And all of those kind of like intricacies make it such captivating television, in my opinion. And so like, I'm a lifelong wrestling fan. I've been watching wrestling literally like out of the womb. And so, and like WrestleMania, it like used to be right around my birthday. So that was always like kind of like the thing was like WrestleMania and my birthday were like, that was my birthday party essentially when I was a kid. And I'm going to be 41 in a month, and WrestleMania turns 41 in 6 weeks or whatever it is. And so we have like a cool little connection there.
Love that. That's awesome.
But I mean, just the way that all three of them, take the audience into consideration, and the willingness to give the audience what they want versus the confidence to say, hey, I've got a better way. That tightrope walk is so difficult to manage. It's so hard to not lose people, especially in this day and age.
Yeah.
And so like,
I'm going on 40 years also.
Exactly.
50
so that
years even.
To be able to do it for so long and so consistently, and like, and Stern's the same thing, right? Like, there's so many people that like, want to, vilify Howard Stern for the person he used to be. But like, he's made conscious decisions to evolve, work with his audience, get a new audience when he needed to, but also like placate the old audience when he sees fit. And so like, like the Butt Bongo Fiesta days and all the like, sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of mentality that existed in the 90s, like when that became passe, he moved on from it, but he kept a lot of his audience because he found new ways to captivate them, whether it was through his interviews, whether it was through, expanding the scope of what the show is. Because I think like when he moved to Sirius, they took greater chances in the like skits that they were doing, or just like conceptualizing different, approaches of how to like, whether it was like the game showy kind of stuff, or just I'm drawing a blank on like the best way to kind of like draw this parallel for them specifically, but like,
Mhm.
but ultimately, like he has callers call in every day, and
Right.
those callers sometimes they know what they're going to talk about, and sometimes the callers throw him for a loop. Sometimes he picks up on something that wasn't necessarily the like intention of the call, and that phone call could turn into an hour-long conversation.
Sure.
And I mean, there's ultimately like that's like the secret sauce of like live performance is like, can you have a conversation with your audience, whether it be indirectly or directly, and can you make that conversation interesting to your entire audience? So sometimes, it's, hey, John from St. Louis, tell me about the weird shit that you're into.
Mhm.
Or, in wrestling's, scope, it's, you guys think we're going to do this thing, but we're actually going to do this thing, but we listen to you. And so maybe we'll change this other thing. And then this, and this happens. There's another thing. There's another like rumor going around that like one of like the main event guys, Drew McIntyre, he was supposed to like renew a feud with a guy that he wrestled like a couple years ago, and everyone was super down on it, and they were like, all right, well, maybe we won't do that then, and so
Mhm.
like, and we're talking about like the biggest show of the year, WrestleMania, 60,000 people 2 nights, 60,000 people each night over 2 nights. It's their Super Bowl. And they're like, shit, all right, well, that plan's not working, let's try something else. We got 2 months to figure it out, let's go.
Yeah. Well, then it becomes like a will they or won't they kind of proposition also, which
Yep.
is equally more enticing even, perhaps.
Absolutely.
But it's really cool about, because I was doing a little bit more reading about Howard Stern, because he's probably of the three, the one that I'm least familiar with. Um, I guess just to break that down, Phish would be the one I'm most familiar with, WWE in the middle, and Howard Stern the least. Um, but really interesting reading about his whole career. A lot of what I know about him comes from the Private Parts movie from
Sure.
like 97.
Yeah.
And then widely publicized moments in his career and his move to Sirius for like $500 million or like whatever, crazy stuff. But it's cool that he's been able to shift with the times, as you mentioned, and in a way, like part of what fueled that and kept his audience was like he never broke the real contract he had with them, which was just honesty.
Exactly.
That was always his thing. He was brutally open and honest about to a fault every thought that crossed his mind that he found of interest, which is all of them seemingly. But yeah, so to move on and actually like grow as a person and learn that like, hey, maybe some of those things weren't really that smart or sympathetic or proper, in a certain way. To move on from that and be able to keep those listeners who are listening to you initially for your shock value. I bet it was kind of a revelation even for them to realize like, holy shit, maybe I actually just like kind of care about this guy and have like this deeper relationship with him than just this shock jockey kind of persona.
Exactly.
Because like through all of it, he's been feeding me like this life story of his, and I've just gotten this like view into a person's mind and psyche that's like so much deeper than really most other mediums can offer, because it's coming at you all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was really interesting, and I mean that certainly speaks to his longevity and what you're saying about these people being able to play the WWE and Phish as well, being able to play the long game so well.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays where like everything is built for immediate gratification, to have these entities that are these institutions, that know how to play the long game, and we're sort of like grandfathered in past the like social media smartphone era where everything needs to be 5 seconds, and are able to continue to play those types of long games and still attract an audience and prove their validity in the the world and the marketplace.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that like when you take the approach that they've taken, you're 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 creating an environment where people are legitimately connected to your project. And that's something that like is ultimately like the most difficult thing to achieve, right? Because like you can write a hit song, you could have an award-winning movie, or you can do whatever this thing is, right? You can be the the hot thing of the week, whatever, right? But when people become attached to the actual entity itself and not the product that they are producing, that's when you've kind of won the game, and it's very rare air to say, like, like a great example would be boxing is in my mind, boxing is a great example. Mike Tyson, at however old he just was, late 50s, 60 years old, I can't remember, right?
Yeah.
Just broke a gazillion box office records for what was essentially a joke match.
Right.
People are invested in Mike Tyson that aren't invested in boxing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Just the same way as, like, you could listen to, I don't know, sports radio, right? You're invested in sports. You're not invested in the people talking about sports. There's some exceptions to that, but, like, sure, ultimately, like, there's the amount of people that kind of transcend the, like, oh, I like this thing. No, it's like, I like those people. And then what those people do is what, it flips the whole thing on its head, because it's no longer a commodity, like, situation. You can still, right, like, obviously, like, have products to sell or have something to, give, but people are buying into the person, not into the thing.
Yeah. Now there's like an emotional purchase that's been granted.
There we go. That's what I was trying to get to. An emotional purchase. I love that phrase. That's fantastic. That is fantastic. And so, like, for anyone, that's trying to, like, break out of this, whatever situation they're in, you could write a hit song 1,000 times, but if no one gives a fuck about you, you're doomed for failure ultimately. You can make money, but are you going to be, like, fulfilled, I guess, right? And so, like, that's always something that I've always really thought deeply about, is, like, what's the most important thing to me? Is it to be financially successful? Is it to be, recognized? It's like, no, it's that people care. I think that ultimately that's, like, the most important thing in the world. And so, like, I think, all three of these things have that in spades, for better or for worse, because, when people care, they're also vocally going to tell you when you're fucking up.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to accept that.
And that is one of the greatest functions that somebody you actually have a deep relationship with can do. Like, I've actually semi-recently have had to have some difficult conversations with some friends, but it was like, like, everyone was appreciative at the end of the day, and it was a good thing as a result, because it was like, no, you need people that care about you to say those types of things. So it's
absolutely
being able to achieve that type of relationship between, like, a formless entity or actual tangible people that you've never actually met, or have any real proximity to, except for, a much deeper, like, psychic one, which in some ways is really, the ones that we have with physical people we're near, isn't it the same thing at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always interesting to me, because I think about, like, especially in music, obviously music is always the easiest one for me to, like, kind of like correlate different things to. So, obviously, like, the Grateful Dead, they kind of, in a weird way, invented that concept within the world of music, right? Like, sure, there was a conversation going on between them and their audience. And then, like, in rock and roll specifically, when things got so big so fast, there was a complete disconnect, and no one wanted anything to do with their audience. And they found other ways to kind of create mystique, or this thing or that thing, but, like, it's so incredibly rare and it's becoming artificially common thing with social media, this idea that you're engaging with your audience, but
Right.
are you though? Are you though? And like talking to them on Instagram, I don't know if I would call that engaging with your audience.
Right.
That's just promoting, whether it's, hey, I'm playing a show, or hey, I'm working on this new thing. Like,
Yeah.
that's
Frankly,
why
that's like your job,
yeah, exactly.
It's basically what
Exactly.
you have to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel, just going back to Lynch, since that's been contextualized with our audience, I feel more engagement with him through his films than I would if he if he responded when he was alive still, of course, if he responded to like a message of mine online, of course I would have gotten like a brief thrill from it, but like the things that I carry with me that are really meaningful about what he did in the world and how it's affected me are like the things I get from his work and his art,
Yeah.
So that's engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And like there's there's the other side of it too, where less is more. So for Phish in the old days, they were kind of guarded and kept to themselves. But then when they were on stage, they opened the doors completely wide open. And it wasn't until in the last like 10 years maybe or so where they really started to embrace a more like open existence, whether it was through social media or interviews even. No, granted, it may have just been that no one wanted to interview them in the 90s, but now people do because they're kind of they've reached legendary status.
Yep.
But there's a more like broader openness to them now. Where conversely, there's like a Howard Stern's kind of like, drawn into his, the pandemic fucked him up. Let's just call that what it is. He doesn't leave his house anymore. But he figured out a way to like, yeah. So
I didn't know that. Yeah.
He's gone. He's gone like Citizen Kane almost. Like he's like locked up in his house. He has this like crazy studio built in his basement, and they stream into the studios where everyone else is still working, and then for very special occasions he'll like actually show up, and that's an interesting thing. But the technology has afforded him that opportunity. He's
right. Yeah,
I mean,
he can be Howard Hughes now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so but I think like that kind of leads us into like the next part, which is embracing technology. This is a very wide spectrum. You could look at it a million different ways, but I think all three of these things existed before the internet existed. So let that notion soak in for a second. And then it can be really easy to say, we don't want anything to do with that, and you see it now with AI. There's this great divide between whether do we embrace this, do we push it away, how do we interact with these new things that are bombarding us constantly? And at that time, the idea of this like digital superhighway was so crazily like daunting, and people didn't really know how, like, originally the joke is that like the internet was invented so porn could exist, and like something like in the 90s, like something like 70% of like internet traffic was porn sites.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not. That might just be a fucking wives' tale or whatever, but like either way.
Honestly, if anything, I would guess that that's been like sugar coated a little bit.
I'm sure it has been. I'm
probably worse.
But all three of them very, very, they took it seriously, and they figured out ways early on to use it to their advantage. And all that did was fuel their success in new ways, which opens the door for more exploratory things within the live environment. Phish, they were doing the message board stuff in the 90s, And then in the early 2000s, they launched one of the first streaming platforms. And
yeah, I remember that, where you could listen to live shows and stuff.
so Live Phish, I mean, predates Spotify, I believe. If I think Spotify started in like 2005 or 6, and Live Phish started in 2002. So to be able to allow people to revisit all these shows anytime they want, and not have to deal with tape trading and all that kind of stuff. It gave more access. It also, like, I think, forced the band to confront, the realities that, like, hey, every single person that listens to us has access to every single show that we play. We have to do more to be better, to do different things, right? So it fueled the idea that, like, all right, every show needs to be unique. Every show needs to be better. Every show needs to be different, so on and so forth, right? It's one of the reasons why, like, comedians, lock up cell phones now, because that their set is their set. They may move some things around, blah, 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 but, like, they can't afford, this guy over here in Phoenix post a video and then, like, ruin the joke, or maybe, but if the joke's not ready yet, and then if he tries a new setup in LA or whatever, it doesn't land because people have already, like, heard this out of context, or, there's this whole, like, very weird sort of,
right. It's like when you see a moment in a, from a movie in a trailer, and then you go to the movie and that moment is, like, completely different context, or, like, happens very differently from what you saw, and it's, like, kind of disappointing. So you're like, no, I was kind of hyped for, like, that moment, you know. But yeah, it just creates that weird expectation in you that once it's not met, is, like, fills you with disappointment.
Yeah. And so, but Phish, conversely, kind of, they were already, obviously every show was already being listened to in one form or another, but they embraced that notion, and they pushed it forward. WWE similarly started the WWE Network, which was one of the first archival TV streaming platforms in the I can't remember when that came out, late 2000s maybe. Yeah. And so they literally just dumped, like, their entire tape library onto the internet, and subscription based streaming, they were at the forefront of that. And they, same kind of thing, right? Where now things that, because, like, there's no reruns in wrestling. They run every week, right? But they created a situation where now everyone has access to every fucking show they've ever done since 1980. Plus, they have access to all of the other properties that no one had ever seen before. So, like, old, like, NWA territory stuff from, like, the 70s and 80s that, like, literally no person had ever watched because it was only aired in,
like,
in
Texas
Tennessee
public access.
Yeah, exactly, right. But what it did was it enriched the culture, because now people realized there was so much more to it, and that it came at a really important time for wrestling, because in the like 2010s was kind of like when wrestling got a little lost for a little while. I think they were trying to do too much and at the sake of the live show itself. And so sometimes you have to have those, like, I don't want to call it, like, rebuilding phases, because that's not what it was necessarily, but it was like, our attention's over here, we're working on this, and this, and maybe we're not quite putting as much effort in over here. And sometimes that's okay. And if you can weather the storm, it usually yields great results, which is kind of like where we're at now. Like, the last, like, 3 years, and a big part of that is Vince McMahon finally leaving the WWE, and a whole new creative team and a whole new ownership team. But they did something really interesting that's never really been done before in WWE, and they utilized that tape library to their advantage, because now they're acknowledging their own history, and they're referencing it, and they're creating like callbacks essentially within storylines. And so they're getting old fans back because they're like, oh, they're doing that thing that I saw in 1994, but they're doing it with a twist.
Yeah.
And
So the new stuff incentivizes you to look at the old stuff.
exactly. And so there's all, so within their purview, they have this like reinvigorated old audience along with their entire new audience, because wrestling is a very it's a constantly moving thing. And I think, there's an aspect of it that's driven towards kids or teenagers, so it's their responsibility to stay modern and current more so than other things. But I think they're doing like an incredible job right now of like feeding old fans and still building for new fans all at the same time. But they're using all of their different technological advantages to kind of, mix that big pot up and be like, okay, we're going to do these things. It's going to nod to that. And like, we're going to get people to want to watch that old thing. And then they're going to think, oh, wow, wait, and it's this whole, you're just fueling the engine of like curiosity almost, through all of the different technological avenues that they have to provide content.
And I would guess that even earlier than that, when you talked about the first WrestleMania, that like their foray into like big spectacle television, at that time was a whole bold move into a new technological frontier, much like them moving on the internet was later.
So, I mean, yes, this one's a little bit more. We could talk about this for a minute because I'm glad you brought it up, because this is actually more profound maybe than even anything I'm talking about right now. But WWE started, WrestleMania 1 was on closed circuit television. Now, I mean, I don't even know how to explain this to somebody who doesn't already know. Basically, wires from one room to another. It was basically just like before all of this stuff, before cable existed even, there was ways to like satellite send from point A to point B only. And so what they would do is they would have the arena where the show was, and then they would have like 6 to 10, I can't remember what the exact number is, other locations, whether it was another arena or maybe a theater, where they would broadcast the show to. And that was all they were capable of doing in 1985. And so you would sell another 5,000 tickets in. So WrestleMania 1 was, it wasn't in the Garden, was it? Oh man, my wrestling friends are going to kill me. Yeah, it might have been the Garden. Madison Square Garden. I can't remember. Either way. So let's just say for shits and giggles that WrestleMania 1 was at the Garden. Sell at the Garden, 18,000 people. But then we've got closed circuit television in Philly, Charlotte, Atlanta, Dallas, right? And Chicago, probably, or something like that. Major markets. People would travel to literally just go watch WrestleMania.
Right. Yeah. I'm traveling to Chicago to go watch WrestleMania on a screen in a room with 5,000 people.
Because that's what the technology allowed at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were that was cutting edge technology 40 years ago.
Yeah. The fact that you could even do that was mind-blowing. People said the sentence I just said, but with like extreme enthusiasm in their voice, like, I get to go to Chicago to sit in a room and watch a screen with thousands of people. This is amazing.
Yep. And then further from that, they were at the forefront of pay-per-view. Pay-per-view was when cable really became legitimate in the late 80s. Wrestling was one of the big things that drove pay-per-view, was that special event thing that you paid. Well, at the time it was probably $20 or $30, and it's only gotten worse and worse as years go on. But those special event things where you could actually watch them in your house, like wrestling, boxing, those were the two big things that really created the pay-per-view industry. for what, and it still kind of exists, but not in the same, obviously, with everything digital now. But so, yeah. So, I mean,
vivid memories of that era when like WrestleMania pay-per-view, like the commercials for it, it was always like such a big deal.
Oh yeah. It was, it was a very big deal.
Yeah.
And then so for Stern, and you kind of brought it up a little bit earlier, we're talking about the biggest radio broadcaster in the world. I don't know that, radio exists the way it does in any other country, the way it does here. He was reaching some, insane numbers via, they call it terrestrial radio. So,
I like that term. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have satellite and then you have terrestrial. And he kind of saw the writing on the wall. Obviously he was dealing with a lot of issues with the FCC and censorship and then sponsorship, because he was so outrageous. Certain companies wouldn't advertise with him, which would, piss off his bosses and blah, 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 blah.
And I didn't realize too that a lot of this was spurned on by the halftime show wardrobe malfunction.
There was, I mean, I don't think that was like a cause or anything like that, but like,
sure,
there was definitely
just created a little bit more of a crackdown on like what was being broadcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, Stern was always under fire, like even back in like the 90s. So, but yeah, it just kept getting worse and worse. And then he heard about this little company called, I think, I want to say it wasn't Sirius XM yet. I think Sirius and XM were independent entities.
Yeah, competitive satellite radio.
If I remember correctly, XM actually had more subscribers than Sirius did when Stern signed with Sirius. But he decided to walk away from the entire empire that he had built in traditional radio and take a chance on a tiny little company that may or may not succeed. And I think it was something crazy. There's some crazy numbers out there. And it's just like with all these streaming things, you never really know what to believe. But like, sure, I think they had less than 1 million subscribers when he signed on. And within like the first like 3 years, they had like surpassed like 15 million or something like that.
Jesus. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like he took a huge risk on technology. He was like, this thing can reach people everywhere. I don't have to worry about government sanctions and censorship and all that nonsense. And I don't have to think about like every 15 minutes we have to do call letters, or every 20 minutes we have to do the weather, or any of the, he literally, he destroyed the entire structure of what a radio broadcast could be. And essentially started the first podcast when you really think about it.
Sure. Yeah.
And he hates that notion. He hates that podcasts are a thing. Even though he started them essentially, but because he still sees Sirius as a legitimate radio environment, just under new terms. So like there was still a studio that you had to go to, and there was still infrastructure, and there was still engineers, and there was, all of the things that come with, in a professional environment.
Yeah.
That's where, he loses people because he thinks that like, because it's,
Oh, well, now he won't leave his home and he's recording from his home studio. He's definitely a podcaster.
But yeah, but he took a chance on himself, but also on the technology at the time, and said, I'm going to help make this technology actually succeed. And he did. And hasn't looked back yet. 20 years later, he hopefully this isn't his last year. His contract ends at the end of this year, and he's undecided if he's going to resign or not. But he's an old man, so we'll see.
Yeah, I was going to say, how old is he now?
He's in his late 60s, 67 maybe, something like that. Yeah.
So doing this for almost 50 years now. If he started in 77, like that's wow.
Yeah. So I think, I think it's interesting how, without even really going into the performance aspect of any of these things, you can see how their approach to themselves, to their brands, to the performance, it creates this greater than existence. And I think this is a good place to pause because my head's a little swirly.
Okay.
And we're gonna do a part 2 next week. While I kind of gather my thoughts, and because I do want to hone in on certain performance aspects, and like the more I'm like searching for that thing, I'm losing it a little bit. So we're gonna write some notes down, maybe for the first time ever on one of these podcasts, but we'll see. I haven't decided yet.
Yeah. Well, there's some things I wanted to ask you just listening to you.
Yeah, let's shoot.
So yeah, I mean, first off, I'm just kind of curious again, like, because I obviously respond very much to like the personal aspect of things, and what you've been talking about is how, these things create that kind of emotional resonance with their audience, that brings them to a much deeper level of connection than just like pure entertainment. So I'm curious, like, to hear, like, what were those moments for you with like Phish and WWE and Howard Stern, where you kind of like had that, I don't know, either eureka moment or first got into it, or kind of like realized, maybe even in retrospect, like, oh my God, this is something that has burrowed itself much deeper into my soul than I expected.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said earlier, with wrestling, like I was born into it. My dad was a huge fan, everyone, like my uncles, everything. So like it was, growing up in New York, WWE was the New York territory. So it was a thing there. And so, I grew up literally in the age of Hulkamania and all that shit. And like, it was just, it's just ingrained in me.
It was, people probably can't even fathom what that was like, but it was everywhere. Like, I was into all that stuff. I had Hulkamania shit all over the place. We watched it all the time. I mean, it was one of those, like, you had to, if you wanted to participate in society, you had to be a Hulkamaniac.
Yeah.
It was like that for a while.
It was. With Stern is an interesting thing because, again, New York, these are all, it's, Northeast bias, man. I don't know. Whatever. But Stern has always kind of been around in my life too. My parents used to listen to him on the radio. And then like in the 90s, he had the E Show also. And like, I used to stay up late and like sneak out of bed and watch that. And like,
that was a big technological kind of medium crossover that I remember too. That being
that's true.
Watching the E Show, like the first time that I ever saw, like, what, they got a radio show on TV? That seems, but it was really compelling.
Yeah. And it was madness. Absolute, like 13-year-old Greg watching either naked chicks or like fucking rock stars or whatever it was, just like chaos for an hour, at 11 o'clock at night, and I was just like, this is the greatest shit ever. And then it wasn't until Sirius, like in like the late 2000s, when I, as an adult, finally got to like listen to it regularly on my own. And at first I kind of said the same thing that everyone else did. I was like, where are all the naked chicks and where's all the, tomfoolery? And like, it still exists, but it's a much more refined show. And I can appreciate that. I think if you're still doing the exact same thing you were doing 20 years ago, you fucked up in life.
Yep.
So, so I'm always of the mindset that like, if to be good at something, you need to constantly work at it, but you also have to allow yourself to evolve within it and not just like anchor yourself to whatever you're best known for or whatever, like it's such a shitty like existence. I feel like, when you look at some of these bands that are just doing the exact same thing they were doing in the 80s or 90s, you're like, God damn it, try something different. I mean, if that's who you are, that's who you are, and that's fine. But like, I think the greats figure out ways to, stay true to themselves, but also like kind of push themselves forward.
Yeah.
And
might be a Bob Dylan quote that he said, that the artist is always in the state of becoming.
There you go. That's perfect. That's a great way to like, and you know, and that's the same thing with Phish, you know, where it's like they are a band that just is always in constant motion forward.
Mm-hmm.
And they're always willing to try some new shit, for better or for worse. You know, and sometimes they fall flat on their face, and they'll be the first ones to admit it, you know, but they succeed more than they fail. And I think ultimately that's like, you know, it's all you can ask for in life. It's that your successes outweigh your failures. But you know, it wasn't until I got to like see them, like really see them like in like 03 when I did like a bunch of shows, and I really got to like immerse myself in it. You know, I had just gotten to college and, you know, did like like 5 or I don't remember how many shows I did, but like did a bunch of shows. And every night I was just like, what the fuck is going on up there? And like, but under different circumstances. And that's what like really, that's when I was like, all right, there's more going on here than just 4 dudes on stage playing instruments. Like they're exploring, because that was my whole thing. Like I was lost. I was like, I'm dropping out of college. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing with my life. So let's just see what happens. And they embodied that mentality, you know, greater than anybody, you know, and like under unfortunate circumstances or terms, I should say, at the time, you know, they were all kind of dealing with substance abuse issues. And so that 03-04 period was very up and down. And there were some really, really, really magical, incredible moments, but there were some really, really hard things to see as well.
Yeah. I remember that.
But the thing that I take away from that, especially now, you know, obviously 20 years later, seeing where they've gotten to, they exposed themselves for whatever it was that they were. They were always honest with the audience.
Yep.
And like, hey, we don't got it tonight. Sorry, but we're going to try our best. And you might get 10 minutes that are going to blow your fucking mind, but we're also going to mess up these 4 songs.
we might start You Enjoy Myself Over.
Yeah, you know, and so, but there was a realness to that, you know, and
I mean, it's amazing that they put their journey as artists on full display, you know, in a time before, you know, you could stream or, you know, reality television where you could have cameras just in a house, like watching people all the time and literally watch it all. Like they were, you know, every night just, hey, we're going to continue pushing this whole thing that we do forward musically and artistically. But, you know, rather than doing it in a garage, we're going to put it on stage every night. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about Stern doing the same thing and, you know, engaging and preserving his audience like that. And honestly, the WWE, I mean, they've been very honest with their audience, you know, for a long time. It was like in the 90s where they were like, yeah, no, it's fake. Like it's all fake.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole other topic that I want to save that for next week, because there is a lot to that. And the psychology of performance, right? And so like that's what we're gonna leave you with, a little cliffhanger, and we're gonna dive into the psychology of performance next week.
Perfect.
And so with that, Dorian, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for enduring all of the chaos in my life.
My pleasure. Anytime. And and thank you for having me as always. It's been wonderful.
Yeah. And real quick, at the top of every description in your podcast feed for the episode description, there's a little fan mail link. So if you want to join in on the conversation, drop us a line, ask questions, tell me I'm an idiot, whatever you want to do. I'd love to hear from you. So this has been The Stroke of Midnight, and we'll talk to you next week.